question of the meaning of being is possible at all only if something like an understanding of being is. An understanding of being belongs to the kind of being of that being which we call Dasein. The more appropriately and primordially we have succeeded in explicating this being, the surer we are to attain our goal in the further course of working out the problem of fundamental ontology. While pursuing the tasks of a preparatory existential analytic of Dasein, we developed an interpretation of understanding, meaning, and interpretation. Our analysis of the disclosedness of Dasein showed furthermore that, with that disclosedness, Dasein is revealed equiprimordially in accordance with its fundamental constitution of being in the world, with regard to the world, being in, and the self. Furthermore, in the factical disclosedness of world, interworldly beings are also discovered. This means that the being of these beings is always already understood in a certain way, although not appropriately conceived ontologically. The pre-ontological understanding of being comprehends all beings which are essentially disclosed in Dasein, but the understanding of being itself has not yet articulated itself according to the various modes of being. At the same time, our interpretation of understanding showed that, in accordance with its entangled kind of being, it has initially and for the most part transposed itself into an understanding of world. Even when it is not only a matter of ontic experience, but of ontological understanding, the interpretation of being initially orients itself toward the being of interworldly being. Here the being of things initially at hand is passed over, and beings are first conceived as a context of things, res, objectively present. Being acquires the meaning of reality. Substantiality becomes the basic characteristic of being. Corresponding to this diversion in the understanding of being, even the ontological understanding of Dasein moves into the horizon of this concept of being. Like other beings, Dasein too is objectively present as real. Thus being in general acquires the meaning of reality, plus or minus accordingly. The concept of reality has a peculiar priority in the ontological problematic. This priority diverts the path to a genuine existential analytic of Dasein. It also diverts our view of the being of interworldly things initially at hand. Finally, it forces the problematic of being in general into a direction which lies off course. The other modes of being are defined negatively and privatively with regard to reality. Therefore, not only the analytic of Dasein, but the development of the question of the meaning of being in general must be wrested from a one-sided orientation toward being in the sense of reality. We must demonstrate that reality is not only one kind of being among others, but stands ontologically in a definite foundational context with Dasein, world, and handiness. To demonstrate this, we must discuss in principle the problem of reality, its conditions and limitations. Under the heading The Problem of Reality, various questions are clustered. 1. Whether the beings which are supposedly transcendent to consciousness are at all. 2. Whether this reality of the external world can be sufficiently proven. 3. To what extent this being, if it is real, is to be known in its being in itself. 4. What the meaning of this being reality signifies in general. The following discussion of the problem of reality treats three things with regard to the question of fundamental ontology: a reality as a problem of being and the demonstrability of the external world. B. Reality as an ontological problem. C. Reality and care. A. Reality as a problem of being and the demonstrability of the external world. Of these questions enumerated about reality, the one which comes first is the ontological question of what reality signifies in general. However, as long as a pure ontological problematic in methodology was lacking, this question, if it was asked explicitly at all, was necessarily confounded with a discussion of the problem of the external world. For the analysis of reality is possible only on the basis of an appropriate access to what is real. But intuitive cognition has always been viewed as the way to grasp what is real. Intuitive cognition, Anchien Erkinen, is as a kind of behavior of the soul, of consciousness. Since the character of the in itself and independence belongs to reality, the question of the possible independence, from consciousness, of what is real, or of the real possible transcendence of consciousness in the sphere of what is real, is coupled with the question of the meaning of reality. The possibility of an adequate ontological analysis of reality depends on how far that from which there is independence, what is to be transcended, is itself clarified with regard to its being. Only in this way can the kind of being that belongs to transcendence be ontologically grasped. And finally, the primary kind of access to what is real must be secured by deciding the question whether cognition can take over this function at all. These inquiries, which take precedence over any possible ontological question about reality, have been carried out in the foregoing existential analytic. From this analytic, we saw that cognition is a founded mode of access to what is real. The real is essentially accessible only as interworldly beings can. Every access to such beings is ontologically based on the fundamental constitution of Dasein, on being in the world. This has the primordial constitution of being of care, being ahead of itself, already being in a world as being together with interworldly beings. The question of whether there is a world at all, and whether its being can be demonstrated, makes no sense at all if it is raised by Dasein as being in the world, and who else should ask it? Moreover, it is encumbered with an ambiguity. World as the wherein of being in, and world as interworldly beings, that in which one is absorbed in taking care, are confused or else not distinguished at all. But world is essentially disclosed with the being of Dasein. World is always already also discovered with the disclosedness of world. Of course, interworldly beings in the sense of what is real, as merely objectively present, can still remain covered over. But even what is real is discoverable only on the basis of a world already disclosed. And only on this basis can what is real still remain concealed. One asks the question about the reality of the external world, without previously clarifying the phenomenon of world as such. Factically, the problem of the external world is constantly oriented toward interworldly beings, things and objects. Thus these discussions drift into a problematic which ontologically can hardly be disentangled. The entanglement of these questions, and the confusion of what one would like to demonstrate with what is demonstrated, and with what guides the demonstration, is shown in Kant's refutation of idealism. Kant calls it a scandal of philosophy and human reason in general 10 that there is still no cogent proof for the existence of things outside us, which will do away with any skepticism. He himself proposes such a proof as the foundation of his theorem, that the mere, but empirically determined, consciousness of my own existence proves the existence of objects in space outside of me. First, we must explicitly note that Kant uses the term existence, Dasein, to designate the kind of being which we have called objective presence in our present inquiry. Consciousness of my existence means for Kant consciousness of my being present in the sense of Descartes. The term existence means both the presence of consciousness and the presence of thing. The proof for the existence of things outside of me is supported by the fact that change and persistence belong equiprimordially to the nature of time. My presence, that is, the presence given in the inner sense of a manifold of representations, is change that is present. But the definiteness of time presupposes something present which persists. This, however, cannot be in us, because precisely my existence in time can first be determined by this persisting with the change present in me, which is posited empirically, and present thing which persists outside of me is also posited. This persisting thing is the condition of the possibility of the presence of change in me. The experience of the being in time of representations equiprimordially posits changing things in me, and persisting things outside of me. Of course, this proof is not a causal inference, and, accordingly, not burdened with the prejudices of such proof. Kant gives, so to speak, an ontological proof in terms of the idea of temporal being. At first, it appears as if Kant has abandoned the Cartesian position of the prediscovered isolated subject. But that is only illusion. The fact that Kant requires any proof at all for the existence of things outside of me already shows that he takes the subject, the in me, as the starting point for this problematic. The proof itself is then carried out by departing from the empirically given change in me. For only in me is time experienced, and time carries the burden of the proof. It provides the foundation for leaping into the outside of me in the course of the proof. Moreover, Kant emphasizes the fact that the problematic kind of idealism which only alleges our inability to prove an existence outside of our own by immediate experience is reasonable and in accordance with a fundamental philosophical way of thinking, namely, before a sufficient proof has been found, never to permit a decisive judgment. But even if the ontic priority of the isolated subject and of inner experience were given up, ontologically the position of Descartes would, after all, be retained. What Kant proves, if we admit that his proof and its basis are correct at all, is that beings that are changing and beings that are permanent are necessarily present together. But ordering two objectively present things on the same level does not as yet mean that subject and object are objectively present together. And even if this were proven, what is ontologically decisive would still remain covered over the fundamental constitution of the subject, of Dasein, as being in the world. The being present together of the physical and the psychical is ontically and ontologically completely different from the phenomenon of being in the world. Kant presupposes the difference and the connection of the in me and outside of me. Factically, he is justified, but from the sense of his proof without justification. It has not been proven that whatever is decided about the being present together of what changes and what persists when one takes time as a guideline also applies to the connection between the in me and the outside of me. But if the whole of the difference and connection of the inside and outside presupposed in the proof were seen, if what is presupposed with this presupposition were ontologically understood, then the possibility of believing that a proof for the existence of things outside of me was still lacking and necessary would collapse. The scandal of philosophy does not consist in the fact that this proof is still lacking up to now, but in the fact that such proofs are expected and attempted again and again. Such expectations, intentions, and demands grow out of an ontologically insufficient way of positing that from which, independently and outside of which, a world is to be proven as objectively present. It is not that the proofs are insufficient, but the kind of being that does the proving and requests proofs is not defined enough. For this reason, the illusion can arise that, with this demonstration of the necessary objective presence together of two objectively present things, something is proved or even able to be proved about Dasein as being in the world. Correctly understood, Dasein defies such proofs, because it always already is in its being what the later proofs first deem necessary to demonstrate for it. If one wanted to conclude from the impossibility of the proofs for the objective presence of things outside of us that this is thus merely to be accepted on faith, this Distortion-Verkehrung of the problem would not be overcome. A preconceived opinion would persist that basically and ideally a proof must be possible. The inappropriate way of approaching the problem is still endorsed when one confines oneself to a faith in the reality of the external world, even if this faith is explicitly acknowledged. Although one is not offering a stringent proof, one is still in principle demanding a proof and trying to satisfy that demand. Even if one wanted to fall back on the fact that the subject must presuppose, and indeed always already does unconsciously presuppose, the fact that the external world is objectively present, one would still be starting with the construct of an isolated subject. The phenomenon of being in the world would no more be met with than it would be by demonstrating that the physical and the psychical are objectively present together. With such presuppositions, Dasein always already comes too late, for insofar as it carries out this presupposing as a being science, and this would not be possible otherwise. It is, as a being always already in a world. Earlier than any presupposition that Dasein makes, or any of its ways of behavior, there is the a priori of its constitution of being in the mode of being of care. Faith in the reality of the external world, whether justified or not, proving this reality, whether sufficiently or insufficiently, presupposing it, whether explicitly or not. Such attempts that have not mastered their own basis with complete transparency presuppose a subject which is initially worldless. They presuppose a subject which is not certain of its world, and which basically must first make itself certain of a world. Thus, being in the world is from the very beginning geared to interpreting, opining, being certain, and having faith, a kind of behavior which is in itself always already a founded mode of being in the world. Problem of reality, in the sense of the question whether an external world is objectively present or demonstrable, turns out to be an impossible one, not because its consequences lead to inextricable impasses, but because the very being which serves as its theme repudiates such a line of questioning, so to speak. It is not a matter of proving that and how an external world is objectively present, but of demonstrating why Dasein as being in the world has the tendency of initially burying the external world in nullity, epistemologically, in order to then resurrect it through proofs. The reason for this lies in the falling prey of Dasein, and in the diversion motivated therein of the primary understanding of being to the being of objective presence. If the line of questioning in this ontological orientation is critical, it finds something merely inner as what is objectively present and alone certain. After the primordial phenomenon of being in the world has been shattered, the isolated subject is all that remains, and it becomes the basis joined together with a world. The multiplicity of attempts at a solution of the problem of reality, developed through the various kinds of realism and idealism, and in the positions which mediate between them, cannot be discussed in this inquiry at any great length. Certainly, there is a core of genuine understanding to be found in each of these solutions, but it would be wrong if one wanted to achieve a tenable solution to the problem by counting up how much is correct in each case. Rather, what is needed is the basic insight that the various epistemological directions do not so much go off the track epistemologically, but that, because they neglect the existential analytic of Dasein in general, they do not even attain the basis for a phenomenally secured problematic. Nor is this basis to be attained by subsequent phenomenological improvements of the concept of the subject, and such a procedure would not guarantee that the inappropriate line of questioning would not, after all, remain. Dasein as being in the world, interworldly beings have already been disclosed. This existential and ontological statement seems to agree with the thesis of realism, that the external world is objectively present in a real way. Since the objective presence of interworldly beings is not denied in this existential statement, it agrees in its result, so to speak, doxographically, with the thesis of realism. But it is distinguished in principle from all realism, in that realism believes that the reality of the world needs proof, and at the same time is capable of proof. Both views are directly negated in the existential statement. But what completely separates it from realism is the lack of ontological comprehension in realism. After all, it tries to explain reality ontically, by real connections of interaction between real things. As opposed to realism, idealism, no matter how contrary plus or minus and untenable it might be, has a fundamental priority if it does not misunderstand itself as psychological idealism. If idealism emphasizes the fact that being and reality are only in consciousness, this expresses the understanding that being cannot be explained by being. But to the extent that it remains unclarified that an understanding of being occurs here, and what this understanding of being means ontologically, how it is possible, and that it belongs to the constitution of being of Dasein, one idealism constructs the interpretation of reality in a vacuum. The fact that being cannot be explained by beings, and that reality is only possible in the understanding of being, does not absolve us from asking about the being of consciousness, of the res cogitans itself. If the idealist thesis is to be followed consistently, the ontological analysis of consciousness is prescribed as an inevitable prior task. Only because being is in consciousness, that is, intelligible in Dasein, can Dasein also understand and conceptualize characteristics of being such as independence, in itself, reality in general. Only for that reason are independent beings accessible to circumspection, as encountered in the world. If the term idealism amounts to an understanding of the fact that being is never explicable by beings, but is always already the transcendental for every being, then the sole correct possibility of a philosophical problematic lies in idealism. Then Aristotle was no less of an idealist than Kant. If idealism means the reduction of all beings to a subject or a consciousness, which are only distinguished by the fact that they remain undetermined in their being, and are characterized at best negatively as unthinglike, then this idealism is methodologically no less naive than the grossest realism. It is still possible that one may give the problematic of reality priority over any orientation in terms of standpoints, by maintaining the thesis that every subject is what it is only for an object and vice versa. But with this formal approach, the terms of the correlation, like the correlation itself, remain undetermined ontologically. But at bottom, the whole correlation is necessarily thought as somehow existent seiend, and thus that it must be thought with regard to a definite idea of being. Of course, if the existential and ontological basis is secured beforehand with the evidence of being in the world, this correlation can be known subsequently as a formalized, ontologically indifferent relation. Our discussion of the unexpressed presuppositions of efforts to solve the problem of reality in ways which are merely epistemological shows that this problem must be taken back into the existential analytic of Dasein as an ontological problem. 16. b. Reality as an ontological problem. If the term reality refers to the being of interworldly beings, res, objectively present, and nothing else is understood by this, that means for the analysis of this mode of being that interworldly beings are ontologically to be comprehended only when the phenomenon of interworldliness has been clarified. But interworldliness is based on the phenomenon of world, which in turn belongs to the fundamental constitution of Dasein as an essential structural factor of being in the world. Again, being in the world is ontologically bound up with the structural totality of the being of Dasein, which we characterized as care. But thus we have characterized the foundations and the horizons that must be clarified if an analysis of reality is to be possible. In this connection, the character of the in itself first becomes ontologically intelligible. By taking our orientation toward this context of problems, we have interpreted the being of inner-worldly beings in our earlier analysis. 7. To be sure, within certain limits, a phenomenological characterization of the reality of what is real can already be given without an explicit existential and ontological basis. Dilthey tried this in the treatise which we mentioned above. What is real is experienced in impulse and will. Reality is resistance, more precisely, the character of resisting. The analytic elaboration of the phenomenon of resistance is what is positive in Dilthey's treatise, and is the best concrete substantiation of his idea of a descriptive and analytic psychology, but he is kept from correctly working out the analysis of the phenomenon of resistance by the epistemological problematic of reality. The principle of phenomenality does not let Dilthey arrive at an ontological interpretation of the being of consciousness. The will and its inhibition emerge within the same consciousness. What kind of being belongs to this emerging? What is the meaning of the being of the within? What relation of being does consciousness bear to what is real itself? All this needs an ontological determination. That this was not done can be finally explained by the fact that Dilthey left life behind, which one of course cannot go standing in such a way that it is ontologically undifferentiated. However, an ontological interpretation of Dasein does not mean that we must go back ontically to some other being seen. The fact that Dilthey was epistemologically refuted cannot prevent us from making fruitful use of what is positive in his analyses, which is precisely what has not been understood in these refutations. Thus recently Scheller took up Dilthey's interpretation of reality. He champions a voluntative theory of Dasein. Here Dasein is understood in the Kantian sense as objective presence. The being of objects is given immediately only in relation to drive and will. Scheller, like Dilthey, not only emphasizes the fact that reality is never primarily given in thinking and grasping. Above all, he also refers to the fact that knowledge itself is, again, not judgment, and that knowing is a relation of being. Fundamentally, what we have already said about the ontological indefiniteness of Dilthey's foundations is valid for this theory too. Nor can the fundamental ontological analysis of life be inserted afterwards as a support. It bears and conditions the analysis of reality, the full explication of resistance and its phenomenal presupposition. We encounter resistance in not getting through, as an obstacle to wanting to get through. But with this willing, something must already have been disclosed, something which drive and will are out to get. The ontic indefiniteness of what they are out to get must not, however, be overlooked ontologically, or, for that matter, be understood as if it were nothing. Being out to which comes up against resistance and must come up against it, is itself already together with a totality of relevance. But the discoveredness of that totality is grounded in the disclosedness of the referential totality of significance. The experience of resistance, that is, the discovery of resistance in striving, is ontologically possible only on the basis of the disclosedness of world. Resistance characterizes the being of inner-worldly being. Experiences of resistance factically determine only the extent and direction in which beings encountered within the world are discovered. Their sum does not first introduce the disclosure of world, but presupposes it. The against and the counter to are supported in their ontological possibility by disclosed being in the world. Nor is resistance experienced in a drive or a will, emerging in its own right. These turn out to be modifications of care. Only beings with this kind of being are able to run up against something resistant in the world. Thus, if reality is defined by resistance, we must consider two things. On the one hand, we have only gotten at one characteristic of reality among others, and on the other hand, the already disclosed world is necessarily presupposed for resistance. Resistance characterizes the external world in the sense of inner-worldly beings, but never in the sense of world. Consciousness of reality is itself a way of being in the world. Every problematic of the external world necessarily goes back to this basic existential phenomenon. If the cogito sum is to serve as the point of departure for the existential analytic, we not only need to turn it around, but we need a new ontological and phenomenal confirmation of its content. Then the first statement is sum, in the sense of I am in a world. As such a being, I am, bin ich, in the possibility of being toward various modes of behavior cogitations, as ways of being together with inner-worldly beings. In contrast, Descartes says that cogitations are indeed objectively present, and an ego is also objectively present as a worldless res cogitant. See, reality and care as an ontological term. Reality is related to innerworldly beings. If it serves to designate this kind of being in general, then handiness and objective presence function as modes of reality. But if one lets this world keep its traditional meaning, it means being in the sense of the sheer objective presence of thing. But not all objective presence is the objective presence of thing. Nature, which surrounds us, is indeed an inner-worldly being, but it shows neither the kind of being of handiness, nor of objective presence as natural thing. In whatever way one interprets this being of nature, all modes of being of inner-worldly beings are ontologically founded in the worldliness of the world, and thus in the phenomenon of being in the world. From this, there arises the insight that neither does reality have priority within the modes of being of inner-worldly beings, nor can this mode of being even characterize something like world and Dasein in an ontologically adequate way. Reality is referred back to the phenomenon of care in the order of ontological foundational contexts and possible categorical and existential demonstration. The fact that reality is ontologically grounded in the being of Dasein cannot mean that something real can only be what it is in itself when, and as long as Dasein exists. However, only as long as Dasein is, that is, as long as there is the ontic possibility of an understanding of being, is there, gypped ease being sane. If Dasein does not exist, then there is no independence either, nor is there an in itself. Such matters are then neither comprehensible nor incomprehensible. If Dasein does not exist, then inner-worldly beings, too, can neither be discovered, nor can they lie in concealment. Then it can neither be said that beings are, nor that they are not. It can now indeed be said that as long as there is an understanding of being, and thus an understanding of objective presence, that then beings will still continue to be. As we have noted, being, not beings, is dependent upon the understanding of being. That is, reality, not the real, is dependent upon care. This dependency protects our further analytic of Dasein from an uncritical interpretation of Dasein constantly intruding itself, an interpretation that follows the guideline of the idea of reality. Only the orientation toward existentiality which is interpreted in an ontologically positive way can guarantee that, in the factical course of the analysis of consciousness, of life, some meaning of reality, even if it is undifferentiated, is not taken as a ground zugrundegele. The fact that beings having the kind of being of Dasein cannot be comprehended in terms of reality and substantiality has been expressed by the thesis that the substance of human being substance des Menschen is existence existing. Interpreting existentiality as care and distinguishing it from reality do not, however, signal the end of the existential analytic, but only lets the maze of problems in the question of being and its possible modes, and the meaning of such modifications, emerge more sharply. Only if an understanding of being are beings accessible as beings, only if beings of the kind of being of Dasein is an understanding of being as beings Seinsverständnis als Seins possible.